Hello and welcome to Samuel's Fortress. I'm your host Kirill, and today we're going to be discussing the birth of Gotse Delchev. Today is February 6th, 2022, so a couple days ago, back on February 4th, it was the 150th anniversary of the birth of Gotse Delchev, who was born on February 4th, 1872, and that is the reason why I'm making this video today. Although we will get to the birth of Gotse Delchev later on in the video, essentially what I want to do here is kind of lay a foundation for the life of Gotse Delchev, kind of explain the environment which he was born into, kind of give a bit of historical context for his life. I kind of want to go back and in the decades preceding his birth and kind of go into some of the historical developments which were occurring in the city of Kukush, the modern-day city of Kilkis in Greece, which is where Gotse Delchev was born. So that's kind of going to be the bulk of the video today, is discussing again the historical context in which Gotse Delchev was born into. And I will be utilizing the book Freedom or Death, or Svoboda ili Smrt, by the British historian Mercia McDermott. For those of you who aren't aware of Mercia McDermott, she is a British historian. She's 94, 95 years old right now, but she spent a lot of the Cold War period from the 50s all the way to the collapse of communism. She spent a lot of that time in Bulgaria, studying Bulgarian history, as well as teaching at the St. Clement Ohridsky University in Sofia, where she taught classes on the national liberation struggle in Macedonia. And she has a number of books related to that topic. She has a book encompassing the entire history of Bulgaria. She has a biography of Vasilevsky, a biography of Gotse Delchev, which is what this book here is, as well as a biography of Janez Sandanski, which we will discuss in the future. But this is the book I'll be using to discuss Gotse Delchev's life, not just in this video, but we'll make more videos in the future discussing other portions of Gotse Delchev's life, his childhood, his becoming a revolutionary, his struggle within the IMRO, and so forth. So with all that being said, let's kind of jump into 19th century Kukush and explore the environment in which Gotse Delchev was born into. So if we go back to the turn of the 19th century, to the early 1800s, we will see a lot of chaos, turmoil within the Ottoman Empire. And this is all something we've discussed in previous videos, but what we're seeing here as the Ottoman Empire begins to weaken is a lot of decentralization, a lot of rogue forces, rogue elements emerging within the Ottoman Empire that are challenging the Sultan's power. Here we're talking about mutinous janissaries, oligarchic pashas, and so forth. So in the first couple of decades, first few decades of the 19th century, we will see a conflict between the Sultan and these rogue forces within the empire as they struggle to see who will de facto control large portions of the empire, including the Balkans. We will see the Sultan manage to regain control from these rogue elements, these rogue forces, as he stabilizes and centralizes the empire. By 1826, the Janissary Corps, which was a real thorn in the Sultan's side, by this point is destroyed. The Janissary Corps is disbanded, and then the following decade, in the 1830s, we will see many reforms taking place within the Ottoman Empire in order to restructure it in a more centralized fashion, directly under the control of the Sultan, as opposed to again, these rogue elements which had been de facto running large portions of the empire up until that point. And it is within this reformed Ottoman Empire, this re-centralized Ottoman Empire, that we will see the Bulgarian national revival really take form. And I have a separate video on the Bulgarian national revival, so if you want a more detailed analysis, detailed overview of that period, what was going on in 19th century Macedonia, in 19th century Bulgaria, the revival period, the struggle for the Bulgarian Exarchate Church and all that, I would recommend you watch that video first, as here I'm going to give a very brief kind of overview, but if you want, again, a more detailed analysis of the Bulgarian national revival and struggle for the Exarchate, go ahead and watch that video. I will put a link to that in the description below. Now, in the beginning of the 1800s, in the city of Kukush, a lot of the economic activity will be centered around the agricultural industry. As McDermott writes here in her book, quote, "The soil was fertile, conditions were favorable for intensive cultures, and the great port and trading center of Salonika was less than a day's journey away, even by ox cart, the slowest form of travel. Apart from grain, the Avret Hizarkaza produced cotton, silk, wool, tobacco, skins, wax, grapes, and other fruits, and sesame and poppies for seeds and opium. Kukush wool was particularly fine and was much valued by foreign merchants, while its tobacco was in quality second only to that produced in Enije. Thus, the transformation of Spahi estates into chiefliks took place relatively early in the Kukush area, and by the beginning of the 19th century, the process was almost complete. Kukush itself became the administrative and economic center of the Kaza, a town closely connected with agriculture, where the produce of the surrounding villages was sold and where many of the citizens were engaged in keeping silkworms, producing grapes, poppies, tobacco, and weaving a variety of textiles. Now, as discussed in that aforementioned video on the Bulgarian National Revival, the revival was really funded by wealthy Bulgarian merchants and farmers who really profited from the 19th century reforms, which we discussed a little bit earlier. Basically, the financing and the creation of the Bulgarian schools, reading rooms, churches, clock towers, etc., was done by these wealthy merchants and farmers and the guilds, which they used as tools to fund the revival. Essentially what happened was, with the destruction of the Janissary corps and the creation of a regular standing army within the Ottoman Empire, this made the Bulgarians very rich, as the empire demanded all kinds of supplies to feed and clothe this new standing army. So a lot of the demand for Bulgarian agricultural products and industrial products began to soar. Here I'll quote a bit from McDermott in that regard. "When the disorders of the time of troubles ceased, and the Spahi and Janissaries were replaced by a regular army requiring vast supplies of uniforms and other equipment, the Turkish Empire entered into a period of economic boom, which lasted from the 1830s until the Crimean War, and Kukush, like many other Bulgarian towns, became a thriving handicraft center, supplying the whole area with copperware, saddles, pottery, wheels, ironmongery, sheepskin coats, articles made of goat's hairs, dyed cloth, bespoke clothes, shoes, slippers, and moccasins, and many other things made by master craftsmen organized in guilds and working in little shops in the Charshia or business quarter. In Kukush, the most important handicraft was the weaving of cotton textiles, and the town boasted more than 300 looms. Merchants gave out cotton on credit, collected the finished cloth, and sold it all over the Turkish Empire. The weavers of Kukush also produced dark brown woolen material, which the poor Jews of Salonika used for their trousers. The boom in trade and handicrafts also created a desire for better education than could be obtained in the primitive cell schools attached to monasteries, or in the haphazard private schools organized in the homes of quote-unquote teachers who could barely read and write themselves. In 1825, the parish council, or commune, had set up a school which maintained at public expense, but although an allegedly well-qualified Greek teacher had been brought in from the outside, the pupils were taught little more than reading, writing, and church singing, all in Greek. This fell far short of the needs and ambitions of the thriving craftsmen of Kukush, and in 1840, a leading citizen named Nako Stanishev persuaded his friend Dimitar Miladinov, who had studied at a famous Greek school in Yanina, to leave his native Struga on Lake Ohrid and come to teach in Kukush. As far as the people of Kukush were concerned, however, the primary attraction was not Miladinov's academic qualifications, for there were in Salonika equally well-educated Greeks whom they could have invited had the question been simply one of obtaining a competent teacher. Miladinov's chief virtue was that, although he taught in Greek, he was a Bulgarian and an ardent patriot. This fact did not escape the notice of Antim, the phaneric Greek bishop, whose diocese embraced both Kukush and Doiran. He denounced Miladinov to the Turks as a subversive person. After only 2 years in Kukush, the teacher had to leave the town in a hurry to avoid being imprisoned. During those 2 years, however, he had done good work, organizing both a primary school on the Bell-Lancaster system and a school with several classes and grades, and a former pupil of his from Ohrid was able to continue the work which he had begun. But still, the people of Kukush were not satisfied. How could they be, when in spite of the fact that there were no Greeks in the town, their schools were conducted in Greek? Even Dimitar Miladinov, as a young teacher, could not write in Bulgarian, and the literate citizens of Kukush wrote their mother tongue with Greek letters. Eventually, Kukush managed to obtain their first truly Bulgarian teacher, a young monk from the Zograf monastery on Mount Athos, who taught the church choir to sing the old Bulgarian liturgy. Exactly when this young monk arrived in Kukush is not known, but since he is described as the quote-unquote first Bulgarian teacher in Kukush, it must have been before 1857, when Dimitar Miladinov was invited to return to Kukush, this time on the condition that he taught in Bulgarian. Miladinov had been teaching in Prilep, but had fallen foul of the Greek bishop in Bitola, and had been forced to give up his post. He therefore accepted the invitation to come to Kukush, where he was welcomed like one descended from heaven, and became principal of the grade school. A little earlier, Raiko Zinzifov had been appointed head of the primary school, also on condition that he taught in Bulgarian. In a short space of time, the two men transformed the cultural life in Kukush. Now, although there was an economic boom of sorts within the first half of the 19th century in Kukush, by the 1850s, with the end of the Crimean War, we'll see that this economic boom will start to collapse, and in fact, the economy as a result of this war will decline dramatically. Essentially, what's happening here as the Crimean War ends and a lot of these Western powers now have a presence within the Balkans, the Ottomans begin importing a lot of goods into the Ottoman Empire from these Western countries, as opposed to buying them directly from the Bulgarian merchants, farmers, directly. So again, Western imports are undermining the native production of various different goods, which is leading to a economic slump, especially amongst a lot of these Bulgarians who are involved in the agricultural industry. Another factor which delayed the development of capitalist production in the Turkish Empire was the absence of stability and the rule of law, so that people who had money preferred to invest it in trade rather than in vulnerable factories and equipment. It was, in any case, hard for anyone to accumulate capital, since taxes, both regular and extraordinary, and the various forms of illegal extortion kept the majority of the population poor. During the second half of the 19th century especially, the country became infested with bandits, many of them Albanians, who robbed and murdered without let or hindrance, and against whom the authorities were utterly powerless. Occasionally the victims were Turks, but even so, few of the culprits were ever arrested. Now, the chaos and the economic decline which are present now in the second half of the 19th century will actually lead a lot of the people within Kukush to leave to go to other regions of Bulgaria, to emigrate abroad, or to seek more radical measures, if you will. The absence of factories and modern industry meant that ruined craftsmen and landless peasants could not become proletarians, as in the West, and as time went by, more and more of them were forced to seek work as seasonal laborers, market gardeners, etc., in Salonika, Constantinople, or the Dobruja, which was the main grain-growing area of Bulgaria. Some even went to Romania, Serbia, Russia, and other countries outside the Turkish Empire. Many are the folk songs which express the homesickness of those who were forced to leave their families in order to earn a living in distant places, returning at irregular intervals to see their loved ones. By the end of the 19th century, things had become so bad that many Macedonian Bulgarians emigrated altogether, not only to the Principality of Bulgaria, which was by then free and independent, but also to Canada, the United States, Australia, and other distant countries, seeking work, security, and all the ordinary prerequisites for a normal life which their own unhappy land could not provide. Some preferred to repay violence with violence, injustice with vengeance, and became haiduti, outlaws in the mountains. Now, while all this is going on, we also see the struggle for the restoration of the Bulgarian church, which will culminate with the creation of the Bulgarian Exarchate in the 1870s. But what essentially had happened in the previous century and at the end of the 18th century in 1766 was that the historic Bulgarian archbishopric in Ohrid was placed under the control of the Greek Phanar, of the Greek Phanariates. These Greek Phanariates, which we've discussed in the past, are essentially wealthy Greeks, businessmen who purchase church positions such as bishop from the Ottomans. This is a purely kind of a business transaction, what's going on here. And these Greek businessmen who assume the role of church hierarchy, like I said, will purchase the position in order to collect taxes from the peasants, in addition to the taxes collected by the Ottoman administration. Basically, the phanariates, these Greek businessmen, will then cut a percentage of this bishop's tax back to the Ottomans. So this has really nothing to do with Orthodoxy or Christianity. This is essentially a purely exploitative system, which is maintained in order to extort a second tax from the peasantry. This, along with the destruction of the Ohrid Archbishopric, with the destruction of the Slavic liturgy, is what is fueling these 19th century protests in Macedonia and the rest of Bulgaria against the Greeks, against the Phanar, and this is really where the struggle for an independent Bulgarian church comes from, where the struggle for the Bulgarian Exarchate comes from as well. The energies of the Phaнаria Greeks were directed not only towards the collection of the bishop's tax, but also towards the eradication of Bulgarian national consciousness. This aim was pursued with particular vigor when the Greek Renaissance and struggles for independence gave birth to the Megali idea, the dream of restoring to Greece the far-flung frontiers of the Byzantine Empire. Thanks to Cyril and Methodius, Prince Boris, and Clement of Ohrid, the Bulgarians had heard the liturgy and read the Bible in their own language, right from the time of their conversion in the 9th century. The Phaнаria Greeks, however, insisted that all services must be taken in Greek, regardless of whether the congregation understood or not, and when the modern schools appeared in the early 19th century, the teaching was also in Greek, even when both pupils and teachers were Bulgarian. During the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s of the 19th century, there were fierce struggles throughout the Bulgarian lands aimed at restoring the Bulgarian language to its rightful place in church and school. And the more obdurate the Phanariates remained, the more the Bulgarians increased their demands and stepped up the pressure. In Kukush, the struggle was particularly bitter and long drawn out. On the one hand, Kukush was a town inhabited almost exclusively by Bulgarians. On the other, it was close to Greece, and the Phanariates were less inclined to compromise than they were in the more northerly Bulgarian lands. One of the first steps, specifically in Kukush, that was taken on this road throughout the 19th century, which will end with the development of the Bulgarian Exarchate Church, is actually the rebuilding of the Church of St. George, which was located on the hilltop sitting above the city of Kukush. That was rebuilt by the local citizens in 1835, with the inscriptions, the new inscriptions on the church being written in Old Church Slavonic as opposed to Greek. A couple decades later, in the 1850s, as we'll see here in McDermott's book, with the help of two Russians, the old Slavonic liturgy will be brought back and will replace the Greek liturgy within Kukush. Two Russians, Igor Yuzhakov and Alexander Rachinsky, who spent a month in Kukush at the end of 1858 and the beginning of 1859, were much impressed by the town's enthusiasm for education and by the new school which had been built during the summer. The Bulgarians give their last grosh for the education of their children, Yuzhakov wrote in an article entitled A Month in Bulgaria, in which he describes their experiences in Kukush and their admiration and sympathy for the Bulgarian people. In spite of their heavy lot, they remained true to themselves, preserving an ardent patriotism in the face of all attempts on part of their enemies to turn them into Turks or Greeks. I now regard the Bulgarians as a people with a rich potential for good, not to say greatness. As soon as the Russians arrived, the people of Kukush begged them to read the service in Slavonic, because they had so few church books and so few of the priests knew Church Slavonic. My God, commented Yuzhakov, this people, from whom we took the Church Slavonic books, who taught us to read and write in Slavonic, this people now begs us to read the service in Slavonic to them. And when Rachinsky began to read, quite a few people wept with sorrow that they had no Slavonic service, and from the joy that they now were hearing it. During the next 10 days, Yuzhakov taught the priests and the pupils from the grade school to read Church Slavonic, and thus helped to establish the Slavonic liturgy in the churches of Kukush. Now, as one can imagine, these developments, the creation of a separate church, the use of the Slavonic liturgy, didn't really sit well with the Greeks, the Greek bishops, and so forth. So we will see here during the 19th century, not just in Kukush, but all over the Bulgarian lands, an intense struggle for the ecclesiastical independence of the Bulgarians. We will need a separate video to kind of do a more in-depth explanation into the Bulgarian-Greek dispute in Kukush, the developments of a Bulgarian Uniate church, and so forth. There's a lot of details regarding the church struggle in Kukush. I don't want to really get into that in this video per se, so we'll save that for another time. But what you should know is that we will essentially have competing a church authority within the city. There will be a Greek parish council, which will be led by a Greek bishop named Meletius. And then we will also have a Bulgarian High Council, which is led by Nako Stanishev and Dimitar Miladinov. These are the two church councils, the Greek and the Bulgarian, which will be competing with each other in the city of Kukush during this kind of middle 19th century period. Now, eventually, this Greek bishop, Meletius, will frame Dimitar Miladinov as well as his brother Constantine as disloyal rebels, as spies, and will turn them over to the Turkish authorities with these kind of trumped up charges. They will unfortunately be arrested by the Turkish authorities, and the two brothers, the two Miladinov brothers, will be thrown into the Istanbul prison where they will later die. Now, Kuzman Shapkarev, who was Dimitar Miladinov's son-in-law, actually records the last words of Dimitar Miladinov as he was being taken to the Istanbul prison, and his last words were, quote, "Why are you so frightened, children? A human life is just a handful of blood. Am I to be afraid for such a little thing? I am going to certain death, but the Bulgarian people will not die with me. They will remain alive, and one day they will be resurrected. Then they will value my blood. I sowed the seed, and you will be alive to reap the harvest." This then was the environment into which Gotse Delchev was born in the winter of 1872. Kukush, militantly Bulgarian, yet gradually slipping into ruin through the bankrupt policies of alien rulers. The Delchevs were one of the oldest and most respected families in Kukush, deriving their name from one Delcho, who was known to have lived in the town during the 18th century. His son Dimitar married a beauty named Maria from a village near Salonika, and in 1844 they had a son Nicola, who was destined to be Gotse's father. The family engaged in trade and was, by Kukush standards, neither rich nor poor, but of average means. In Kukush itself, Nicola owned a house, a tavern, and a shop, while outside the town he had an acre or so of vineyards, a slightly larger area of arable land, and several hundred sheep. He would buy sheep in the spring, graze them during the summer under the care of a hired shepherd, and in the autumn he would sell off as many as possible and slaughter the remainder to make pastarma, dried salted meat, which he sold in Drama, Kavala, Seres, and Salonika. He made his own wine in rakia, and in one of the cellars under the house, bottles of wine 20 or even 30 years old were kept buried in sand. Most of the time, Nicola worked in his tavern, which was in the corn market, and on Thursday, which was market day, he would serve hot meals as well as drinks. Nicola was no mean chef, and his chevirme, meat roasted on spits, attracted a large clientele. Besides all this, Nicola traded in grain. Like most Bulgarians of his era, Nicola considered work a virtue and idleness a vice. He was never idle himself, and he would not tolerate idleness in his children. On his return home, he expected to find his daughters knitting or sewing, and his sons busy with their school books, and woe betide any of them whom he caught with no visible occupation. Within the four walls of a Bulgarian house, the mother reigned supreme. The man was the ultimate authority in all family matters, but he seldom interfered in the running of the home. He provided the wherewithal, and left the rest to his wife, who so organized the labor of the other females in the family, that the men always returned to find the home in perfect order, with spotlessly clean floors and cobbles, with newly baked bread and steaming food on the table, with freshly drawn water in the pitchers, with a storeroom full of homemade pickles and preserves, and an ample supply of hand-woven silken sheets, rugs, carpets, personal linen, etc., for both current use and for the daughter's trousseau. Usually the mother had many girls under her to cook, launder, and clean, for families were large, and it was customary for the married sons to remain under their father's roof. The mistress of the Delchev home was a woman as soft-hearted as her husband was stern. Her name was Sultana, daughter of Yane Nurjiev, and she came from the village of Murarci in the Karadag. As a girl, she had been known as a beauty, and like all Bulgarian women, she was shy and modest in her demeanor, respectful of her elders, obedient to her husband, and tirelessly industrious. Her outstanding feature, however, was her loving kindness. Without her, the house would have been a much colder and more impersonal place. Nicola loved his children and made sure that they lacked for nothing, but he was undemonstrative, a man of few words, so that his strictness was generally more evident than his love. Sultana was the hearth that warmed the home, that radiated light and offered comfort to all those who crossed the threshold. And here we can see in McDermott's book pictures of both Nicola and Sultana. Sultana bore her husband a total of 9 children, 4 boys, Gotse, Mitso, Milan, and Christo, and 5 girls, Rusha, Tsotsa, Tina, Velika, and Elena, and all were a credit to their parents. Gotse's birth was a particularly joyful event in the life of the Delchevs. The first 2 children were daughters, and this was not a propitious beginning in a society where men were all important. Indeed, according to ancient custom, a newborn baby girl would be placed in the cradle for the first time when the moon was on the wane, in hopes of discouraging further female births, whereas a boy was introduced to his cradle when the moon was new, so that the next baby might also be a boy. Until the moon was in the appropriate phase, babies were laid in a large upturned sieve, which was convenient both as a container and as a symbol, for sito, the Bulgarian word for sieve, also means well-fed, thus ensuring that the baby would be contented and quiet. The Delchev's firstborn son was born on January 23, 1872, or February 4th in the new style, and he was christened Georgi, after the patron saint of the ancient monastery above the town. The name, however, was seldom used verbally, and from the very first day of his life, his mother and the whole family called him Gotse, according to the Bulgarian custom, which makes diminutives from every name. Now, sadly, young Gotse was very sick for the first few years of his life. He suffered from constant illness, from a lack of appetite. Essentially, he was a very skinny, frail, sickly child up until the age of about 3 years old. And his parents, Nicola and Sultana, tried all sorts of different folk remedies to heal the child. However, nothing really seemed to work. Nicola and Sultana tried everything that reason or rumor suggested would heal their ailing child. When, for example, Nicola heard of the healing powers of a certain village fountain, he immediately set out with his son wrapped warmly against the winter cold. When they arrived at the fountain, Nicola would have bathed him there, and then in the icy water, had not a woman filling her pitchers protested that it would be the death of such a skinny and feeble child. She even offered to give Nicola one of the pitchers so that he could take some water home where it could be heated. Nicola accepted, and Gotse was bathed and rubbed down in the warmth and comfort of his home. Eventually, to the great delight and relief of his parents, the child took a firmer grip on life and grew out of his illness and became a normal, healthy boy. The change was all the more welcome because the next 2 children were girls, and until 1879, Gotse was Nicola's only son and heir, a sole boy amongst 4 sisters. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next time.